On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, it's the October 4th, 2021 edition of What the Ship is Going On. We're going to look at 5 top stories over the past week in the world of shipping. First, we'll look at bottlenecks around the world. What's causing the backlog of vessels? Second, we'll look at carrier reliability at an all-time low. Then bulkers are on the rise. Next, we look at the power situation in Europe and in China. And then finally, we're going to stop taking shipping and seafarers for granted. All this on What the Ship is Going On. Hi, I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. I am the chair of the Department of History, Criminal Justice, and Political Science here in beautiful North Carolina. Also a former merchant mariner and an instructor in courses in maritime security, maritime history, and maritime industry policy. Okay, a lot going on this week, a lot of stories to tap into with a lot of sub-stories underneath that. But first, I want to thank all our new subscribers, everyone who's following us on YouTube. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much. Please take a moment, if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos when they come out, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, share it across social media, and I've even started a Patreon page to get some funding to help improve the quality of what's going on with shipping and to give myself more time to devote to this, because there seems to be a real need, or a real want, I should say, for some in-depth analysis of what's going on with shipping. So let's go ahead and head over to our first story. So this first story comes from the guys at FreightWaves, Todd Maiden, with this story, Pick Your Bottlenecks, Port, Chassis, Containers, and Labor. And basically one of the things that Todd is really highlighting right here is the fact that there are many factors impacting the growing fleet of vessels at anchor off of not just Southern California, not just LA and Long Beach, but also Houston, Charleston, New York, and around the world for that matter. And as he notes, there are really 4 things that we're looking at here that are all playing a factor in here. We've got the ports, obviously. We've got chassis. That's that rig that the boxes ride under for the back of the tractor trailers. We've got container issues, and we have labor issues. There are so many factors that are all contributing to this backlog. And there's not one single thing. I did a video just the other day talking about the 5 primary reasons for maritime, for the shipping industry. But again, trucks, labor, rail, all have issues that are associated with this. And we get a great story here that kind of breaks it down. We're talking about the lack of labor. Again, it's not just hiring someone to drive a truck. They got to be trained. They got to be qualified. Many truck drivers are independent drivers, which means they have to get rates. They have to finance themselves, got to get insurance. There's a lot that entails the movement of goods. California law has strict emissions and quality. You can't just buy a used truck that's old. You have to buy a truck that meets the emission standards to get into the yards in LA and Long Beach. And it makes it very difficult to go on. He goes in here about the fact that basically they're buying everything in sight. This includes truck chassis. We're seeing that. One of the things that the big container companies have done is gotten rid of their chassis fleets. We saw that. It talks about the spinoff of Maersk. The company invested over $2 billion over the past decade to grow its fleet of chassis, but now they're getting out of that. So it's a lot of independent contractors, a lot of business firms that are doing this. And again, companies had to right-size their fleets. They didn't want chassis sitting around doing nothing and doing maintenance on them. They wanted the right size. So getting the chassis to the right place is important. 24-hour port operations is not a cure. It's great to have the gates open all the time, but if you can't offload them in a warehouse, it doesn't do you any good. And so 24-hour operations isn't always the solution. And what we're seeing is the West Coast is getting more and more logjam. Now, at the same time, there were some other stories that talk about the fact that, for example, U.S. factory growth is at its highest in 4 months. We are actually doing great business-wise right now, but there are looming potential shortages on the horizon. At the same time, we've talked a lot about the movement of empty containers out of the ports of LA and Long Beach, but U.S. exports are at an all-time high because of the volume that's involved. They're just not getting enough exports, in their opinion, out. So that's story number 1. Story number 2 comes out of Container News, and it really struck me when I saw this story. Schedule reliability hits all-time low in August. Maersk stays on top. So this looks at the major container lines and looks at their reliability, their schedule reliability, the ability to get cargo where it's supposed to be on the date that you want it to arrive or you book it. And one of the things that you see in this study right here is how bad it is, that it's hovering between 35 to 40% for most of the year. You can see in here this chart from Sea Intelligence that really graphs it out. 2018 is the blue line. The orange line is 2019. You're hovering right around 70, 80% nearly. And then 2020, up until about half the year, you're right there at about 70, 80%. And then all of a sudden, it just nosedives down in mid 2020. So you get to 2021, and you're hovering between 35 and 40%, with a low of 33.6 in August. This is terrible for reliability, for your ability to book cargo and ensure its arrival on time. And you can see that here. You can see the global average delays for late vessels arriving. Vessels are arriving later. You saw it down here. It was roughly between 4 and 5 days. Now we're up almost 8 days for vessels to arrive late on berths. And again, that's because of the availability to get on the berths. It's because of delays in the system. It's because of backlogs in the ports to be able to offload the containers and move them off the terminals. We're seeing lots of issues added. And then when you look at the carrier scores, these are looking at all the major shipping lines right here. When you look at all these carrier scores, where they were with August of 2020, that's the kind of the dash line there. You can see Hamburg Sud, Maersk Line. Hamburg Sud is actually a subsidiary of Maersk. Some of the highest carrier scores right there. Now we see the decrease. Evergreen went from over 60% now, and they're about 10%. PIL, Wanhai, Yangmin, OOCL, Costco, really toward the bottom. Now Maersk, Hamburg Sud, MSC, which are all in the 2M alliance, are doing the best. And that's a big issue of their reliability. But again, if you look at stories across the board relating to this, one of the things we're seeing is the fact that container rates are continuing to jump. We've got out there the equivalent of 3.5 Hanjin Marines, which were a shipping line that went bankrupt in 27, just sitting out there doing nothing right now, waiting to get into port. I mean, that's how much we've immobilized shipping right now. We're seeing just shipbuilding orders at a record high right now. And even the head of Hapag-Lloyd came out and says that shipping is still in the thick of these supply chain disruptions and things are not going to get better anytime soon. So this measurement right here by Container News, I think, is really one of the most interesting, because it's talking about reliability and how low reliability is. And that's what's pushing contractors, shippers to really look for different options for getting their goods, because they can't get reliable service right now from the big ocean carriers. Story number 3, bulkers heading for super cycle 2.0. So bulk ship, we talk a lot about container ships so far. Container ships carry modular containers on board. Bulk ships are vessels that look a lot like tankers. They look a lot like they carry oil, but instead of carrying oil, they have these massive hatches on board that open up, and you load bulk material, ore, grain, any type of commodity that's loose that's in this large bulk area, hence bulkers. Bulk carriers are heading for what they call a super cycle. Prior to 2008 recession, shipping was at its max. You look at shipping companies, you look at profits, you look at volumes, it was great. 2008 was huge. And in 2008, 2009, you see that massive decline because of the global recession triggered by the housing crisis. Well, bulkers are on that rise again. This story in G Captain by Reuters talks about that, talks about the increase. Rates for Capesize, Panamax, Supramax, and Handysize vessels jumped 235 points, highest since September 2008. Those are all the different classification sizes. Vessels that can go through the Panama Canal. Vessels are smaller. The vessels that are limited to the Cape route around the Cape of Good Hope can't go through the Suez Canal, for example. And one of the things you see is average daily earnings on 150,000 ton cargoes, iron ore, coal, rose from $5,000 to $75,000. That's a big increase. Now, there's a lot of issues going on here. They talk about the fact about exports from Brazil and Australia being a factor. One of the problems coming out of Brazil right now in South America is low water levels in the Rio de Plata. Australia is in the midst of this trade war with China, but America is booming from this because grain shipments, because of shutdowns in New Orleans due to hurricanes Ida and Nicholas, have shifted bulkers. So you see bulkers loading out of Seattle, Tacoma, Vancouver right now. You also see bulkers being used to transport other commodities. Coca-Cola just joined the group that have chartered a vessel. They're chartering handy-sized bulkers to carry bulk material for the manufacturing of Coke. Not containers, but the bulk material they're loading on board. And so we're seeing earnings for bulk carriers increase dramatically. This is another sector of the industry we're seeing. And in particularly, one of the areas that we're seeing a big demand for bulkers is going to China with coal for fuel, which we'll talk about in a second, and then also with grain to support food. Again, China only has 8% arable land. They need to be importing food all the time. And if they can't get the food they need, they suffer greatly as a result of that. Story number 4 builds on the bulker story that we just talked about, and this is China's power crisis, which is kicking off a global race for coal. This is on GCaptain. It's a Bloomberg story. You can see right here a coal bulker. You can see those big, they look like container cranes, but they're actually big conveyors. They dump coal into the hatches here, these open, just massive hatches, and load the vessel down with coal. And one of the things we're seeing here is the absolute shortage of coal right now going to China. China, almost 90% of its fuel is coal. And it says here more than 2/3 of China's electricity comes from coal-fired plants. And again, while 90% of its fuel it uses mined locally, it's difficult to raise local output at short notice. And what it needs right now, because of increased demand, is more coal. Now, normally it would get it from Australia, but as it says here, it's been complicated somewhat by Beijing's decision to ban imports from Australia. If you look at the review of maritime transport, they show you how much ore comes out of Australia going there, which means they got to grab ore from other places. And so they're looking to South Africa, they're looking to Colombia, they're looking to the US, and they're looking to Canada. And all of that is going to fuel China right now. Understand, this could disrupt, there's a story in Container News that talks about that this may disrupt the $120 billion trade flow coming from China. They're having brownouts, they're shutting down factories because of reduced power outages. It says right here, at least 17 Chinese provinces and regions making up 66% of the country's gross domestic product have announced some form of power cuts, mostly targeted at heavy industrial users. And again, this is very similar to what we saw at the beginning of COVID in spring of 2020, when we saw a slowdown coming out of China that kicked off this whole cycle. I just, again, did a video where I looked at the maritime issues, the 5 top maritime issues that relate to this. Number 1 was COVID. Now, this could be good news for us because it lets us get caught up, clear the backlogs out of the ports. But the long-term issue, is it better to have ships at the anchorages loaded with goods waiting to offload, or to have no ships at the anchorage and empty berths and waiting for ships to come across? Because that's the situation that you're seeing right here. And this issue has the potential, again, to be a big one as we go forward. Our last story on what the ship is going on is one that I always try to hit that is really well below the radar of most people. And this story on GCaptain by Mike Schuller, I think, really encapsulates it. So Mike wrote this story, "It's time to stop taking shipping and seafarers for granted." September 30th was World Maritime Day. That comes on the heels of World Seafarer Day. But one of the things that is not really appreciated is the role of the 1.6 million seafarers out there who man the 50 to 60,000 vessels that are involved in international trade. When COVID shut the world down in March of 2020 and everybody locked down, this shipping and seafarers did not lock down. Matter of fact, they kept the world going. It talks about right here. Trade groups representing $20 trillion of annual world trade, 65 million global transport workers, more than 3.5 million road, freight, and airline companies, and over 80% of the world merchant fleet, world shipping fleet, warned that the global transportation systems are on the verge of collapse. And that story, which is one that's out of Lodestar, is an interesting one because, again, it talks about the fact that these mariners, these rail workers, these truck workers, these essential workers that move goods around, not just the planet, but around the United States, may be on the cusp of breaking down. I can speak specifically from seafarers. One of the issues we had with the seafarers out there where they were unable, number one, to rotate home. This is before vaccines. They were unable to get vaccines. No one was vaccinated. And countries would not let them off the vessel to fly back home at the end of their tour. They usually worked anywhere from 4 to 6 months on the vessel every day, 25 to 30 mariners on a vessel. They were unable to get home. And believe me, 7 days a week, 8 to 16 hours a day takes a toll on an individual, especially when you're with the same people all the time. The world international community has an agreement. Mariners aren't supposed to work more than 11 months, yet we saw mariners out there for over a year. That means accidents. That means the reliefs who were supposed to come out had to find other jobs because they weren't being flown out there. The mariners on board may not return back to the vessels because they don't want to be stuck on vessels again. And the low priority we gave to seafarers, everything from priority for flights to vaccinations, has been a problem. And this is eating away at the maritime sector. It's like a cancer that's really under the surface that people don't know is there until it comes out. And one of the things you see in Mike's article, which is great, and there's a few other ones that looked at this. Lodestar just did one about global supply chains close to collapse. We saw an issue in GCAPTAIN just this week about a sexual harassment issue at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. Again, issues facing mariners afloat. And then there was a great piece, I thought, in Maritime Executive on the low profile of the maritime industry. But the problem with this piece was the title, low profile, just literally, that's all it was. And you didn't see the story buried in everything else. Literally, the low profile story was low profile. But right here, one of the things we're seeing here in this last chapter, last paragraph, I think is really the key. That's why the IMO selected seafarers at the core of the shipping's future as the theme for this year's World Maritime Day. For most seafarers, and the role they play in the global economy is out of sight, out of mind. I get it. But my point for the point for this year's World Maritime Day is it shouldn't be. That 90% of trade I mentioned earlier is more tangible now than ever before. Let's treat seafarers as the key and essential workers that they are. I'm looking at you, heads of governments. Without ships and seafarers, we may as well be living in the Stone Age. I think Mike Scholler hits it right out of the park on this one. And I think we all should be paying attention to shippers, seafarers, truckers, people working on railroads. Everybody involved in the supply chain right now needs their attention. I'm going to advocate shippers and seafarers because I was one. So that's the top 5 stories we had for what the ship is going on. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please share it. Go ahead, give it a thumbs up, hit subscribe, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos when they come out. Share it across social media. And again, if you want to help keep bringing videos like this to you, then please take a moment, and if you can, subscribe to the Patreon, contribute whatever you can. I'm happy with whatever I can get. I can upgrade my technology. I can get some people in to help me with editing. I can make this look a little bit better if we had some video magic. So for this episode, this is Sal signing off.